It's time to change your world. It's time to let it go. The things you used to think, the things you used to know, they don't help you anymore. It's time to change your mind. If it's peace you want to find.
This is Kurt Kaikonen, pastor of Calvary Chapel, Waterford, at your neighborhood church. Today on Change Your World, we'll be in the book of Daniel. So grab your Bible and let's get started.
It's time to change your world. You need to let it go.
So today we're beginning the book of Daniel. Well, Daniel is one of the most attacked books in the whole Bible. And the reason that the book of Daniel is attacked is because it accurately lays out the course of history and the kingdoms of the world with such precision. But when the book of Daniel was written, which was about 600 years before Christ, everything that Daniel wrote was all prophecy. And so the traditional view of Daniel, which is our view of Daniel, is that he wrote this book after the Babylonian captivity. Now, the main reason that we believe this is because Daniel himself, he claims throughout this book that he himself wrote the book, where Daniel, he self-identifies himself as the author, and he does this several times throughout the book. But to put this to rest for all of us believers, all we have to do is read what Jesus said about Daniel in Matthew 24:15 and Mark 13:14, because Jesus gives Daniel the credit for the writing of the book of Daniel when he says, "Therefore, when you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet." Now, when Jesus says that, that really should be enough for us. But the critical view of the authorship of Daniel, it was only developed because the prophecies of the future events was too accurate, which basically means they didn't believe in predictive prophecy. And so they make up their own view out of their unbelief. So what they say is that the writer of Daniel is only using Daniel's name, but that the writer is not writing prophecy, but he's only writing history. And the book of Daniel, it couldn't have been written any earlier than the 2nd century before Christ, where they're actually saying that it was written about 165 BC during the Maccabean period. But you have to realize, he's called Daniel the prophet. He's not called Daniel the historian. And you would have to realize that their view is impossible, because the Greek translation, the Septuagint, which is a translation of the Old Hebrew Testament, it was translated in 250 BC, before Christ. And it also included the book of Daniel. And they even found fragments of the book of Daniel from that scroll in the Dead Sea Scrolls, and it was with all the other books that were written before the 2nd century. And there's other problems for those who have this critical view of Daniel in giving it a late date. And that's that Daniel, he himself was a contemporary with Ezekiel and Jeremiah, where Jeremiah, he was a prophet in Jerusalem, where Daniel, he was taken to Babylon in 605 BC because he was one of the first among the captives. But Ezekiel, he was taken captive 8 years later in 597 BC. In the second group of captives, where now this prophet Ezekiel, he mentions Daniel a few times in the book of Ezekiel. So you have to go, well, how can Ezekiel mention Daniel if Daniel's born 4 centuries later? But to be fair to them, they have other arguments for their critical view. But to be honest with you, none of them hold water. All right, and so when Daniel was written, all these prophecies were future events. But from our place in history, half of these prophecies in Daniel, they haven't happened yet. Because Daniel's prophecies, they reach all the way to the end times, where they overlap with the book of Revelation. And so before we start, what we need to see is that for decades, way before the book of Daniel was ever written or began, God had warned the rulers of Judah through the prophets like Isaiah and Micah and Habakkuk, that their idolatry would lead their nation of Judah into judgment, and then they would go into exile, where God was basically saying to them, so if you want to serve idols, I'm going to send you to the land of idols. I'll send you to Babylon. We're here in the book of Daniel. This is the beginning of that exile, where the exile of Judah will last for 70 years. And the reason it's 70 years is because Israel, they never gave the land of Israel its Sabbath rest, which was commanded by God. Where on the Sabbath years, which was every 7 years, Israel wasn't supposed to plant the land. They were to let the land rest. So Israel ended up owing God 70 years. So there are two reasons for the exile. So one is Judah's idolatry, and the other is that they willfully disobeyed the Sabbath years. In Daniel's ministry here, it will last the whole 70 years. But even when this exile is over, it will only be a small remnant of Judah that will return to Israel. And it's not because they couldn't, it's because they had established prosperous lives in Babylon and in Persia. And they didn't want to return. And even Daniel himself, though he didn't do it out of rebellion, he also never returns to Israel because he stays and he serves God to the end, but it's in Persia, it's not in Babylon. And there's really a single message in the book of Daniel, and that's found in Daniel 5, verse 21, which is, the Most High God rules in the kingdom of men and appoints over it whomever he chooses. And so what that means is that God rules over all, and he overrules over all, and that God himself, he is in control of human history. That's meant to comfort us, and it's to comfort us especially during the times of darkness, where God, he has dominion over all the kingdoms of the earth, even during the days of wickedness, all the way until the end times. All right, so now in verse 1, it says, in the third year of King Jehoiakim's reign, and we know that that year is 605 BC, which means it's before Christ. And then it says Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, came and besieged Jerusalem. And so to give you just a little more understanding why the king Nebuchadnezzar is attacking Jerusalem, and the whole reason he's even in this area, that's because King Jehoiakim, although he was a descendant of King David, and he was placed on the throne in Jerusalem, he wasn't really placed on that throne by God. But he was placed there by the Pharaoh of Egypt. And what the Pharaoh of Egypt did back then is that this Pharaoh, he took his army and they went and they invaded Babylon, Nebuchadnezzar's kingdom. And so Nebuchadnezzar, he responds to this invasion and he attacks Egypt in the city of Carchemish, where Nebuchadnezzar, he now chases that Egyptian army all the way down the Sinai Peninsula into Israel. And since he happens to be there, Nebuchadnezzar, he attacks Jerusalem. And that's because they were loyal to the Pharaoh in Egypt, who's the one who put King Jehoiakim in charge. And so this was all about 605 BC. And these records, they're not found in Jewish history, but they're found in the Babylonian records. But they were quoted by the Jewish historian Josephus, who wrote the book Antiquities, where these actual Babylonian records were found in 1887, where they were kept in a British museum and later published. So these records, they actually gave us a detailed military information about the first 10 years of Nebuchadnezzar's reign. And then if you go to Carchemish, they found a lot of these military artifacts, things like arrowheads and spears in the layers of the ash. And Nebuchadnezzar were now the reason he's cutting short this sieging of Jerusalem. The only reason he's cutting it short is because he gets news that his father has died. And so Nebuchadnezzar, he now has to race back to Babylon to secure his throne because Nebuchadnezzar, he was a co-regent with his father, which that means that they shared the throne. Father and son were both the king. And so Nebuchadnezzar, he travels this 500 miles back in just 2 weeks, which was an amazing feat back then. Okay, so now with this first siege of Jerusalem being cut short, not many captives were taken, but it did contain the children of the royal family and the nobles. And the thinking here was that Jerusalem's leadership, that they would be much more cooperative if we have their children with us. And then later he has 2 more sieges on Jerusalem, with the second one being in 597 BC, where he takes 10,000 more captives, and they'll be deported to Babylon. And that's the one that included Ezekiel. But then he has his final siege in 856 BC, where Nebuchadnezzar, he razes a city and he destroys Jerusalem along with God's temple. All right, so now you have Nebuchadnezzar, and he's back in Babylon. And we see from here that it's his policy to take and to train the very best candidates from the people that he conquers, and then he puts them into his service. And so now he's instructing this master of eunuchs to find out who's the best of Judah, which was not only who looks the best, but who's intelligent, and who are these ones who are quick to understand things. And these candidates, they're going to be enrolled in Babylon's 3-year university, U of B, and they're going to be brainwashed with total indoctrination and to become Babylonians. And they're going to forget their Jewish heritage. And they're going to learn all about the Babylonian language and all about its literature, all about their customs and pagan gods. And after that, they're all going to get government jobs. And so we're told here that these were nobles, with some of them even being from the royal family. And it is rabbinic tradition that Daniel was a descendant of King David, where he was actually from the royal line. So now we get down to verse 4, and that word for young men used here, well, what that describes, it describes teenagers from the ages of 13 to 17, where it's believed here that Daniel and his friends were about 15, 16 years old at this time. And though Ashpenaz here, he's called the master of the eunuchs, not everyone believes that Ashpenaz was a eunuch himself. And there's quite a few commentators that they'll say that Daniel and his friends, they probably didn't become eunuchs either. And they say that this word, although it literally means eunuch, it's used for anyone who comes into any type of court official or any kind of royal officer. But there is this prophecy in Isaiah 39:7, where it actually says, "And they shall take away some of your sons who will descend from you, whom you will beget, and they shall be eunuchs in the palace of the king of Babylon." And that was written way back in Isaiah. And so now you have these 4 young men who were basically kidnapped and ripped away from their parents, and they're taken to this strange land, and they're made into slaves. And then we find out that they may have been castrated to make them single-minded so that they would only serve this pagan king, so they wouldn't be having any families of their own, so they would have no other desires, while this pagan king is destroying their homes in the land of their God. And now they're being forced to learn their pagan ways and to forget their heritage along with their God, where their identities are being stripped away and they're even given new names, where all of their birth names, which speak of Yahweh, where Daniel, it means God is judge. Well, now his name is changed to Belteshazzar, which means it represents a pagan god, Bel, which means Bel protect him. And then his friend Hananiah, his Hebrew name means Yahweh has been gracious. But now it's changed to Shadrach, meaning illumined by the sun god, where one guy I read, he said it just means the command of Aku, which is another one of their false gods. And then there is Mishael, whose Hebrew name means who is what God is. Now his name is changed to Meshach, which means who is like Shaq. And it's not talking about the basketball player Shaq. They're talking about this Babylonian goddess who's kind of like the Babylonian equal to Venus or Ishtar. And then lastly, you have Azariah, whose name in Hebrew means Yahweh has helped, where his name now becomes Abed-Nego, a servant of Nego, where these teenagers, they can handle most of this, where they can handle the captivity and the loss of their identity. They can even handle the name change. And they can even put up with this secular education in a pagan school. But what they're having a hard time with here is eating their food. And it's not because the food didn't taste good, because this was the same exact food and wine that the king himself was eating and drinking. But their problem is that it's not kosher. And so this would be meats like maybe horse meat and pork. And all these meats and wines, they've all been offered to their idols, to their false gods. And these Jewish boys, they don't want to defile themselves and break the Mosaic law because they feel like that will separate them from their God. And you kind of have to realize here that even with these four not eating the king's food, all the other Jewish kids, they did. But Daniel here, he's not demanding his way, or he's not having some kind of hunger strike. He knew he didn't have any rights in Babylon, and he also doesn't want to get this Ashpenaz in trouble, because this Ashpenaz, the master of the eunuchs, he's been really good to him, because that's what it tells us here. It says that God had given Daniel good favor with this man. So Daniel, he only asks Ashpenaz for a test, to just let them eat vegetables and to drink water. But it's not because they really want to be vegetarians. And I know that there's a diet that's called the Daniel diet, but I don't believe Daniel here is trying to create this new diet to make him closer to God. He just doesn't want to break God's law if he doesn't have to. He wants to remain an undefiled Jew if he can. And I'm really kind of amazed at Ashpenaz that he says yes to Daniel. Even though this is only a 10-day test, this really was at a risk to Ashpenaz. But he must really like Daniel. But I believe it's also because God is honoring these four young men. And so they become fatter and healthier, but there is no biological reason for them looking fatter. But then again, there's also no natural reason that they were gifted and they received all the knowledge and skill that they received, where you kind of have to see that all of this is from God, that all of this is spiritual. Because even though they're submitted to the king of Babylon, they first submitted themselves to a greater king who was God. Where most people in Daniel's position, they would have thought that God had deserted them. But I believe that Daniel and his friends, they all believe that God has placed them where they are to accomplish his purposes. And them only eating vegetables, it doesn't mean they just ate vegetables. They also ate grains. It's kind of just like a kosher vegetarian diet. All right, so now after their 3 years at Babylon University, these four fat, healthy young Jewish men, they graduate. And they graduate summa cum laude, which means they graduate with the highest honors. And then they're given their new government jobs at the palace before the king. And then these four, under the king's personal examination, they're found to be smarter than anyone else in his employment. So these are like four Elon Musks, or whoever who you think is smart. Maybe they're Mark Zuckerbergs or Bill Gates or Jeff Bezos. But these guys, they're not just smart. They're also godly men. Where here it says that they're 10 times better than those listed in verse 20. So they're 10 times better than the magicians and the astrologers. And in the ancient world, those people meant scientists. But during this era, these type of wise men, they also did things like conjured spells and incantations to communicate with the spirit realm. Where the magicians, they were people who dealt with the occult, and enchanters, they used incantations to accomplish their purposes. Where sorcerers, though that also means drugs, they specialized in casting spells. But then the astrologers, what they did is they studied the movements of the stars and how they influenced the events on earth. And diviners, they did all different kinds of things. They had different methods. But these are all pagan practices, which are all strictly forbidden in the Mosaic law. But these are the guys that Daniel and his friends are having to work with in Babylon. All right, so now we get to chapter 2. And nobody is 100% sure of when this is happening, that if it happened like after the 3 years of Daniel's training, or if it happened kind of in the middle of it. But there's a thing about the keeping of time and their reigns that somehow years, they can kind of overlap. So this isn't really clear of when it happened, but it's probably due to something to do with Nebuchadnezzar's being a co-regent with his father. But here it's calling this Nebuchadnezzar's second year. And where it says he had dreams, it's using the plural there, dreams. But he's really having the same dream, and he's having it over and over again. And it's leaving him unable to sleep. And we don't know when the king gave the command and called his wise men, because it actually could have been in the middle of that very night, because he's the king and he's in the process of conquering the whole known world. So he has a lot of pressure on him. And now he's not sleeping at night because he has bad dreams, which isn't good. Okay, so now he calls his magicians, his astrologers, sorcerers, along with the Chaldeans. And Chaldeans, even though that's the name of the Babylonian people, here what it means they're priests who serve as astrologers and soothsayers. And so Nebuchadnezzar, he's calling his dream team. And so he's not really calling Magic Johnson, Michael Jordan, or Larry Bird. It's not like the 1992 American Olympic basketball team, but here Nebuchadnezzar's dream team is kind of these guys that are all demonic, and that's where he's getting all his wisdom. His wisdom is all demonic. And so just like Martin Luther King, this king, he says, I have a dream. But unlike Martin Luther King's dream, this dream is not a dream of peace where everybody's going to get along, but this is a dream that causes him to lose all his peace. And he's very anxious to know what this dream means. And right here, right after verse 3, the text of all the writing, it all changes. Because from the beginning, from Daniel chapter 1, from its very beginning, all the way up to chapter 2, verse 3, this has all been written in the Hebrew language. But here at chapter 2, verse 4, and all the way to the end of chapter 7, it's now going to all be written in the Aramaic language. And this is the only place in the whole Bible where the text is written in the Aramaic language. And the reason it's believed that it's written in Aramaic here is because he's writing to the Gentiles in the language of the Gentile world, which at this time happens to be the Babylonian language. And so all these subjects that are going to be covered in these prophecies, it's all about the Gentile nations' future kingdoms. But then when we get back to chapter 8, the text will return again to the Hebrew language. And that's because from chapter 8 to the end of the book, the Hebrew text is primarily being written to the Jewish people. All right, so now here in verse 4, we have the Chaldeans, which again means they're priests, and they're speaking to the king in Aramaic. And now they're asking him to tell them the dream, and then they will give him the interpretation. But that's not what the king was asking for, because the king, he wasn't born yesterday, and he knows that if he tells them the dream, they're just going to make something up.
You need to change your world. You need to let it go. Oh, oh, oh.
Thanks for listening to Change Your World. Change Your World is an outreach of Calvary Chapel, Waterford, and your neighborhood church. If you're listening to Change Your World in the Detroit metro area, why don't you join us for church this Sunday? Our service time is 10 a.m. at Calvary Chapel, Waterford, 183 South Winding Drive, Waterford, Michigan. We're competing with the Catholics. It's only an hour. All the donuts you can eat, and you don't have to believe a thing we say, but it could change your world.
You need to change your world.
The rest of today's message can be heard at yourneighborhoodchurch.org. So check us out and download the app. And until next week, remember,